I grew up in a little town in the Midwest, and I grew up the son of Republican, Rotarian, very churchy people whose life was heavily dominated by the church. So to some extent, the 50s for me were a time really of value formation, and it was very conservative values formed in that little town in Council Bluffs, Iowa, that later seemed to be so grossly violated by what I saw outside. I mean, for me, there was no hint, I don't think, in the 50s. Man, I drove cars too fast. I chased around with other kids. Mostly cars were sort of the dominant culture, and you go to the drive-in and find somebody to go drag race with. I mean, that's what you did.
What values?
Well, the values were ones that I was taught very narrowly. I'm my brother's keeper. Very church-oriented kind of values. Everybody's equal in the eyes of God. You shouldn't go to war. It was sort of, that one, of course, was always sort of odd because you were supposed to be a peacemaker and the Prince of Peace, Jesus, the Prince of Peace, and all that sort of stuff. And at the same time, of course, that tended to be the basis for going off on crusades, too. I mean, looking at it a little later, but at the time, I really was taught a set of very conservative values, which in fact, to a great extent, I still hold. But they had to do with peace and justice and brotherhood, and I thought that's the way the world was. I mean, it was a small, basically white high school, town, life, and I didn't know, or I didn't see. I mean, it wasn't that there wasn't racism. It was simply that I didn't recognize it until I saw it outside years later. My family was a teetotaling family, and later it's like those Ross MacDonald novels set in Southern California where when something happens and then you discover that there was some sort of, back in the 1930s in some little shady motel down in Long Beach, there was something happened. Well, I suspect there was a lot of that in my family someplace, but I don't really know that. And what I knew was my grandmother was fighting fluoridation of the water. She was active in the DAR and thought fluoridation of the water was a communist plot. Life magazine did a series on Elm Street, USA. She lived on Elm Street. They asked to come photograph the church bell choir on a Saturday morning in her living room, and she refused to allow Life magazine in because she thought it was part of a communist plot. They were going to go around and photograph people in their houses, and they'd get to know about what Americans were by photographing Elm Street. We're talking here Bible Belt, hardline, Iowa. I grew up in a town where I walked home for lunch, 7 or 8 blocks when I was in kindergarten or first grade. I'd walk home at lunch and then walk back, and I knew everybody in every house, and I knew all their kids, and everything was safe and secure. It was a very cocoon-like environment in which to grow up, very bucolic. The values of the community were, or appeared to be, nearly universal and almost universally applied. That is, everybody was expected to stand up at the same time, salute the same things, believe the same things. Now later, of course, I discovered that wasn't true at all, that there were vast differences. And also, where I grew up, there is an immense amount of anti-Semitism in the Midwest. It's just rampant. I shouldn't say that about the Midwest. I don't know about the Midwest. There are in places where I knew. There is in places where I knew. A tremendous amount of anti-Semitism, and that was sort of part of the culture too. But it was sort of understated. You were expected to stand up and pray. That's the deal, right? I was expected to grow up to be a pillar of the church, a pillar of the community, a solid citizen. That was the expectation. I'd go to college. I always knew that I would go to college, probably that I'd end up coming back, I think in my father's fondest dreams, go back and go into business with him. It was actually quite a startlingly different experience for me to go away to school, and terrifying. I tried to get back in the car. When my parents dropped me off, they drove back to Iowa 2 weeks later. They came through. I tried to get back in the car and go with them. I was out of here. I couldn't. I can't take it. Everybody here is smarter than I am. Everybody here knows more than I do. Everybody here is more sophisticated than I am. Everybody here is something that I wasn't. I mean, to be an academic, to care about academic things in high school was to be a complete nerd, to be, I mean, we didn't know that word, but was to be just out of it. So you went out of your way to not be, or not be seen to be, smart. And suddenly I was in an environment where learning was okay. It was okay to be smart and to want to read books and do all those things. I fell in with my best friends were a guy who grew up in India, whose father was a Rockefeller Foundation doctor in India, a guy whose father was with the United Nations, who had grown up mostly in Thailand and then in Hawaii, and a black guy, my roommate, a guy by the name of Jim Page from Compton, California. Well, all of a sudden, I went from white bread America to a place that was totally different than anything I had known, and where the values were, I mean, where the notion of what was acceptable, what was okay, what you wanted, was dramatically different. I mean, I was a young Republican in 1960. And while I wasn't very happy about what the Republican Party did, I was probably to the right of the mainstream of the Republican Party at that point. I was to the right of the mainstream of the Republican Party. Kennedy somehow or another made it, I mean, it was different. I didn't think of myself as a Democrat, an Easterner. I mean, I didn't have any of the sort of cultural resonance that I might have had I grown up someplace else. But he was, for reasons of energy, to go from Dwight Eisenhower to John Kennedy is to go from your grandfather to your big brother or something. I mean, it was a stunning change in pace. These were real issues on which at least it appeared to be possible to make a difference. You had a president who was saying, you matter, it can make a difference. What you do matters, you have an obligation. And you have a bunch of people who are inclined to be idealistic anyway, just because of age, and you have a set of issues that are immediate and real, where you really can make a difference, and where you saw your peers making a difference. It was spring of '62, as I recall. I was conservative. I was a freshman in college. I still had all these Midwestern values. I was reading a lot of books, talking to different people. It was all real exciting. And I can't remember whether it was Herbert Aptheker or Bettina Aptheker or somebody was invited to this little Baptist college campus where I was in school to come speak. And the administration said, she can't come speak. Or he can't come speak, whichever one it was. Well, that was like, what do you mean they can't come speak? And so everybody whipped out, whoever it was, John Cardinal Newman, who said the university is the free marketplace of ideas, and how can you have a free marketplace if some ideas are excluded, and so on and so forth. And we fought through this thing, and I was writing some for the college newspaper then. And I wrote this column based on sort of traditional academic freedom, university values. And the university refused to publish, came down and censored the newspaper. Well, I mean, now all the rules are broken, right? But not by us, by them. We immediately started publishing an underground newspaper that we distributed, which was just vilely critical of the administration and everything they stood for. I mean, it became an immense attack on everything. The character of the president of the university, the chapel services, the hypocrisy of the faculty, I mean, it was sort of, it was a moment when you suddenly look up, or at least it was for me, and said, well, wait a minute, all this stuff I've been taught all my life, the very people who've been teaching me don't even believe it. What kind of deal is this? And that's a fairly life-changing kind of moment when you're 18. I had, I think, in the eyes of this little town where I grew up, fallen in with a bunch of bad actors. And what I had done, what I was doing, was not acceptable. My ideas were not acceptable. And my relationship to my father was, to both of my parents, was very strained. My father had gone off and enlisted in World War II, was anxious to go fight, got turned down by one service, enlisted in another. He was going to, you know, that's what he was going to do. And it was seen, perceived as the right thing to do. And to raise the kind of fundamental questions about the country, it was even, actually, it was impossible for my DAR grandmother. I mean, forget that. That was not a subject that could be discussed. For my father, it was as if somehow, by that time I was not active in the church. I'd sort of lost any faith in the church. And I think it was like I was a fallen son. I'd gotten in with bad company. I'd left the church. I was chasing around. My life was unacceptable, and my views were unacceptable. And it was very hard on them because, particularly in 1968 and 69, there was some press, some notoriety that attached to what I was doing that made it back into the local papers. And I remember very clearly, once my mother, we didn't talk a lot during that period of time. It was very strained. And I remember my mother calling frantically. I mean, it never happened. I didn't hear from them. They didn't hear from me. I mean, it was just separated for long periods of time. And I remember her calling frantically, looking for me. And I was living in a group house, a commune, I suppose, or something. Anyway, a bunch of us were living together. Phone rang. Mother just frantic because she didn't know where I was. And she'd gotten a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning from somebody who called and said, your son is dead, and we're glad, and then hung up. Right? She didn't know where I was. I mean, I could have been in Timbuktu for all she knew. Well, that, I think, was, interestingly enough, that began to change them. I mean, that and the fact that friends of theirs stopped speaking to them because my views were unacceptable, they suddenly, they began to change. And certainly by 70s, or around 1970, maybe even 69, I just don't recall clearly, they too began to think that, wait a minute, maybe this war is not all it's cracked up to be. I went back to my high school, Abraham Lincoln High School in Council Bluffs, Iowa, selected me as a distinguished alumnus. And I went back to this dinner where to receive this award. And my old Boy Scout troop leader came, who's now a much older man, and my parents, and sort of the newspaper. It was, I mean, that's it's almost 30 years after I left Council Bluffs that I really felt there was a kind of homecoming, that there was a kind of, okay, maybe those years were not what we thought, and maybe you're an okay person.